Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is January 23rd, 2020, and we are off to a great year so far on Mormon Stories Podcast with lots of really cool stories. And today we are going to be continuing our interview with Sian Coombs. I was so thrilled to interview Sian last week. Sian is Welsh, so she's from Wales in the UK, and she had a particularly fascinating and compelling and wise and thoughtful interview last week that focused around a lot of really important topics, but what it's like to grow up Mormon in Wales. We talked about, the church's modesty and sexual standards. We talked about teen pregnancy in the church, talked about Sian's life marrying a convert to the church. And then we talked about her life in the church, her faith crisis. And that's kind of where we ended, which included a discussion about her husband's faith journey as well. And so we're really excited to continue the interview today. And what we are going to do is also kick off our first ever part in a series that I'm calling the Thrive Interviews. What I want to focus on for 2020 is this notion of thriving beyond Mormonism. So it's really important to learn factual church history. It's really important to understand the church, the truth about Mormonism, what it is, what it isn't. And it's important to process all the anger and sadness and pain that goes along with discovering that the church isn't what it claims to be and even distancing yourself from the church. All that is really important. And what's probably even more important is the life that you build after leaving Mormonism, if you leave it, or if you leave Orthodox Mormonism. And so Thrive is simply an attempt to help Mormons heal and grow beyond Mormonism. And so we get feedback from time to time about the length of Mormon Stories interviews. I'm never going to stop doing the long-form interviews, so you can just expect those to continue. But what we're going to experiment with is a new format where when we get to the portion about kind of where the interviewees are now and, how they think about and reflect upon their faith crisis and then where they're going, what we're going to do is we're going to ask a series of, 18 or so questions, and we're going to invite others to be a part of this series. And the entire goal of the whole thing is just to systematically provide people with lots of role models or examples of thriving beyond Mormonism. So that's what we're going to do now is we're going to conclude our interview with Sian by asking her a series of questions. And we hope that those of you who are looking to heal and grow beyond Mormonism or to process your experience will find this series valuable. So really quickly, I'm just going to do 15 seconds of announcements. We are really excited to announce that Natasha Elfer Parker and I are doing our next Mormon Stories retreat here in Salt Lake City, February 21st and 22nd. It's going to be 2 full days of our standard Mormon Stories Faith Crisis retreats. And we would love to have you join us if you are looking to heal and grow beyond Mormonism or in a faith crisis. So you can go to mormonstories.org/events and you can register for that event. Please tell your friends. Scholarships are available. So if you can't afford the registration fees, which we've priced really cheap, but if you can't afford them, please fill out a scholarship application, and we would love to have you come. We also want to announce, again, we're having a Thrive Chicago event, April 24th through 26th in Chicago. amazing attendees are going to be there. We'll be announcing the program soon. But if you are in the Midwest or want to travel to Chicago in the spring for an amazing event, check that out as well. Okay, so thanks to everyone who's joining us for the live stream. We're really happy to have you here. And Sian Coombs, welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast, all the way from Wales.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
How's it been surviving in Wales doing a Mormon Stories Podcast interview? Are you holding up?
Yeah, it's been okay. Yeah, I've had lots of people that I've not had any contact with for a while get in touch that have seen it and things, so that's been nice.
And your husband is Paul, right?
Yeah.
How's Paul doing?
He's good.
Good. Well, we appreciate his support. So let's see. Let's begin with something we haven't done before, which is asking you a series of questions. And by the way, you mentioned previously kind of your intent for doing these interviews. Do you want to reiterate kind of today why you're doing these interviews, especially acknowledging that you have family that you care about who are still in the church and Orthodox?
Yeah. Okay. So I knew doing this interview that potentially I was going to upset and hurt people, and that's not something I want to do. It's kind of the risk I've taken, but it's not something that I'm particularly comfortable or happy with. But I really, really feel like these podcasts are really valuable, and they really have. They've helped me in the last few months, and I know that by sharing our stories and sharing our experiences, that we can help each other through this difficult time. So that's kind of my main reason why I felt that I wanted to do this. Is just to be a help to other people, and to be honest, I think it's been good for me to be able to speak and to share kind of how I feel about things, because there aren't too many people that kind of want to hear, that want to listen. But in this, doing it in a podcast, you're hitting the people that want to hear it. If you've tuned in to listen, you've chosen to listen. So you're kind of speaking to the people that are happy to hear, rather than maybe speaking to people that might not want to hear your experience. That's kind of how I feel anyway. And
you're definitely not trying to take people out of the church. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say so. I think the way I've conducted myself since leaving church shows that. I've not been shouting, and I've not been trying to share everything I know with everybody that I've my friends and my family. I've kind of tried to keep things to myself. The people that tune in are the people that already potentially have issues. I'm not trying to kind of spread things around, or no, certainly not. Like when I first found out the things that I found out that led to my faith crisis, it's one of the first things I said was that I wasn't going to damage other people's faith, certainly not intentionally. That I wanted to keep things to myself as much as I could, because I didn't want to be that person. It hurt me. Finding all that stuff out hurt me, and I kind of said, I'm not going to be telling anybody. So yeah.
So if you feel like your faith may be in jeopardy, turn this off now, because our desire is not to hurt it, right?
Yep.
And Sian, I just want to acknowledge, I just went back and read our text back and forth. You and Paul were kind enough to have Paul come on Mormon Stories. I wasn't intentionally ignoring that. And I'd love to have Paul on another time. We can schedule that. But please know I wasn't ignoring that on personally. I'm sure it would be great to have Paul's perspective.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So when we pulled together these Thrive questions, the idea was just to provide people with the ability to reflect on their Mormon experience and allow them to ask maybe some of the more cogent, deep questions. And this not only lets us sort of segment people's responses in ways that we can maybe reuse through a book or through a video series or whatever. It allows people to jump to the parts that they're really interested in. And then finally, it allows It allows us to make sure that we're touching on some of the most important topics that affect people. And I've had many people actually share that just going through the process of asking themselves these questions and answering them really has been kind of therapeutic. So I really do encourage people to go to the Thrive post on Mormon Stories where these questions are posted, to have people go through the process of writing out their answers to each of these questions and submitting them. And what we hope to do is create this entire library of dozens, if not hundreds, of people sharing and answering these questions in a way that can be easily consumed by anyone who might be interested. So listeners, see if you like this format today, and we would love your feedback one way or another. But here we go. So we are now going to start with question number 1 for you, Sean. And we start kind of with the positive because it's really important for us to remember the positive about our Mormon experiences for no other reason than it helps us understand what our needs are after Mormonism, and it helps us make peace with our past and become kind of an integrated self. Because if we hate Mormonism, but Mormonism created us, then to some degree we're kind of self-loathing. So it's important to kind of, as part of the healing process, to make peace with and even have gratitude for our past when possible, and then integrate it into our future. So the very first question I want to ask you, Sean, is what parts of the Mormon experience were most important or useful to you as you reflect back? Now, of course, we've already talked about this in our interview, but if you had to just kind of directly address that question, what would be the parts of Mormonism that were most important or useful?
Okay, this is actually one of the questions that I found most tricky, because it's really hard to kind of point things out of your experience. I think when you grow up in the church, being Mormon, it's just your whole life. It's everything. And so you kind of, everything within your character is kind of interwoven with that. And I think that's kind of how it's designed to be. You know, we go through the youth program, and callings and all these things are designed to build our character a certain way, I guess. And so for me, it's kind of, I don't know if I'm making any sense. It's kind of the whole character that it's built within me, and the whole community and everything that, it's just kind of, am I making sense or not?
It's kind of comprehensive, isn't it? And when you say character, do you just mean honesty and integrity and hard work and all those sort of values that you learned?
Yeah, I think growing up in the church, and you kind of feel like when you do it properly, it really builds this kind of strong. We always said, I remember talking to family saying, we're made of strong stuff. We don't say no to callings. We do everything. We do hard things, and it kind of really, builds this kind of, strong character.
Yeah, that's great. And that, we nurture that through this pioneer legacy, right? That from the very start, Mormons were persecuted, and then we were pioneers, and we crossed the plains, and many people joined us from Europe, and Mormons can do hard things. And it kind of breeds in us some resilience, the ability to work hard, to endure, and that just serves you well in life. And then, like you said, if you couple that with community, then you've got this group of people around you that love you and care about you and want to support you. And what's not to love about that?
No, definitely. Yeah, there's so much good, isn't there? There's so much good in the church. And obviously, sometimes, we might be guilty of maybe focusing on the bad, but of course, the good, there's plenty of good. And I think another thing for me, in terms of kind of my Mormon experience, is I've always felt like personal revelation's been a big part of kind of my life, that sort of praying for answers for things and kind of having your life guided, I think. And that's kind of how my life has always felt. I felt like I've always had that kind of guide, through good times, bad times, all sorts of things.
And we'll talk about that. I want to hear kind of what you still believe, whether you believe in God and the Holy Ghost or any of that kind of stuff. But yeah, feeling like life has a sense of purpose and that we're being guided can give life a sense of meaning and help us kind of feel like there's a direction and a purpose. And so many people out there just are saying, what's the purpose of life? Why go through all this pain and suffering? What's the point? And it sounds like you're saying Mormonism answer those questions for you in an important way.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go to question 2. What doctrinal or theological parts of Mormonism did you believe that were most important to you? So here we're talking about kind of doctrine and theology, those teachings about God or heaven or the gospel or whatever.
Okay, so firstly, I'd say the plan of salvation, knowing who we are, why we're here, where we're going, and how we get there. I think that's kind of a very fundamental, basic thing that we're taught in the church. And that's, like we just said, answers all these questions that people have about why we're here. And we had all those answers. We knew exactly why we're here, where we've come from, where we're going, all those sorts of things. Then after that, I think the atonement was definitely really important to me. As I grew through the church, as I got older, I kind of developed a deeper understanding and testimony of that. When I was younger, the atonement was very much about sin and being forgiven of sin. And then as I got older, I started to understand that it's deeper than that, and that it was about our weaknesses and our hardships and our pains and sorrows and all the bad things that happen to us that aren't necessarily sin, that the atonement could help us with those things. And that was really important to me. And then obviously the big one that is unique to Mormonism, which is eternal families. That's kind of what we all want. We all want to be with our families who we love forever, and that's the ideal. That's kind of why we all do what we do, because we love our families and we want to be with them. So yeah, that was kind of the next big thing that was always really important to me.
Yeah, eternal families is such a compelling concept within Mormonism. Who doesn't want to be with their family forever? And especially if you've had parents or children or siblings die, just the idea that you can be with them forever is just so beautiful. The atonement is also beautiful if you feel like you make mistakes or made mistakes, that there's a way for you to be forgiven and to make that right. That can be so relieving for people, right? Of course, it's a double-edged sword, and if people refer back to your interview and the teenage pregnancy sort of things, that's double-edged sword. But it's interesting that even though you experience church discipline and some pain and suffering regarding kind of the church's enforcement of the law of chastity, it's interesting you still mention the atonement as one of your, one of the most important parts of Mormon theology and doctrine.
Yeah, I think maybe it's as I've got older, I guess my kind of testimony in those things got deeper. And so I guess maybe, all those years back when, I kind of, be able to put that in the past and maybe kind of move on from that, I guess.
Yeah, totally. Makes sense. All right. Next question. What spiritual experiences did you have as a Mormon that sealed your Orthodox commitment to the church? We talked about this as well last episode, but there are usually a few kind of foundational spiritual experiences that really seal people to Mormonism. What were those, if any, what were those for you?
Okay, so I think kind of being born in the church, I didn't ever have this like big experience where I really gained my testimony and knew it was true. And I didn't have, a mission to prepare for. So it wasn't like I needed to kind of go through those things for me, it was more kind of gradual, where I just got to the point where it's the only thing that made sense to me. So I haven't got like a big kind of conversion story as such. But I definitely think that I kind of grew up feeling like I was, the chosen generation, that I was special, that I was reserved for this time. And that kind of gives you this feeling that, you kind of got, I can't explain.
Let me ask you this, and you can think about this as I'm asking. Sometimes when I wanted that kind of epiphany of an experience, like that lightning bolt kind of thing, I would be told, to wonder whether I've been receiving the witness all along, that kind of the daily lived spiritual experiences were the testimony, not necessarily some huge lightning bolt of inspiration. Do you think that's kind of what you're trying to say? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm just brainstorming here.
Yeah, I think I definitely haven't had that lightning bolt thing, but I definitely think that through life, kind of as you go through things and you might have questions or whatever, I'd kind of feel like I'd have little experiences, which, when you're going through them can be kind of just as powerful in a way, like little scriptures might come to your mind, and that's like your answer to something. And they're kind of like your small little experiences that you have that, I did seminary for 4 years and kind of had, I was really big on learning my scriptures. So I had lots of scripture masteries, and in my, when you'd have kind of questions or troubles, you'd have this scripture that would pop into your head, and that would feel like that was the Spirit kind of reminding you of that. Like I'm sure I've had experiences where, I've had a question and I felt like I've had the answer given through a talk, or through singing a hymn, and a line in a hymn jumps out to me that I've not noticed before, and I feel like that's my answer. Jeffrey R. Holland, I always felt was absolutely speaking to me. He always has a way of making you feel like what he's saying is just for you. And so I definitely had those spiritual experiences. And I definitely think music was also a big one for me. Growing up, I sang in like youth choirs and was part of kind of Easter musical things and different things. And I always felt like that really kind of built my testimony and kind of made it ingrained within me. So yeah, that's what
So moments of serendipity, it sounds like, and music were really big things.
Yeah.
I can relate to both of those. Music was really important for me. That's cool. Okay. All right. On to the next question. The next question being, how, just in summary form, how did you lose your faith in Mormonism? What happened? How did the dream start to shatter?
Okay. So obviously I spoke about this quite a bit in my other one. So go back and watch
People
that.
can refer back and listen to that whole thing.
But I kind of say, but in a nutshell, I'd say that I decided to allow myself to think, which I'd always just accepted everything the church taught me. And I kind of decided that I was going to just think for myself and listen to how I felt inside, because some things didn't feel okay. And I kind of always just brushed them off and thought that God knows better than me. And I just accepted them. But I kind of decided that I would allow myself to just think. And as I started to think, things started to unravel a little bit. Which then eventually led on to kind of the CES letter and all those sorts of things, which kind of sealed the deal, is what I'd probably say. Funnily enough, I didn't mention this in the last one, but this is kind of a little funny story-ish, is that I watched a documentary on Michael Jackson, and it was Leaving Neverland. So it was all about, the abuse claims. And I watched the first episode, and I was a bit of a Michael Jackson fan, absolutely convinced he was absolutely innocent. So I thought I could watch it and nothing would kind of change that opinion. So I watched the first episode. And then I started to maybe I didn't want to watch the second episode because maybe he wasn't innocent and maybe my mind would be changed. And I think I've always been kind of one that doesn't want to think bad. I would rather believe good than bad. And so I kind of didn't want to know. I decided that I would continue on with it and watch it because I came to the realization that whether I watched it or didn't watch it wouldn't change whether he did or didn't do what he did. Like me watching it wouldn't alter the truth. And so that kind of flipped a little switch in my head, which made me realize that whether I kind of look into something or don't look into something doesn't actually change whether it's true or not. And I guess if you put that with the church, like if I read or study or look into things, if it's true and nothing will harm that. And if it's not true, like, who am I protecting? And not, like, there's kind of no point in kind of pretending that certain things didn't happen. Or I kind of just changed the way I saw things, where once upon a time I only ever wanted to look for the good. I thought that was kind of a positive character trait of mine, and I didn't want to know kind of the bad. But then I started to feel like, that truth was the way it was, regardless of whether I knew it, and that I kind of wanted to kind of be a bit more open-minded. So that's kind of like, there were lots of little things like that, little switches that kind of changed, which eventually changed the way I saw things and led me to allow myself to study. And I didn't study, things, anti-Mormon, terrible things that people assumed that I studied. It starts with studying, the gospel-specific essays and all these sorts of things, and learning more about Joseph Smith and polygamy and all these different things. So that's kind of how it all started for me.
So it sounds like you started to apply logic and critical thinking skills, and deciding that you shouldn't suspend Mormonism from the laws of evidence and critical thinking. And once you allowed yourself to start holding Mormonism and the Mormon Church up to true scrutiny, things started to fall apart. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, because before that point, I never even allowed, every time that a doubt would come in my head, I would just think that I don't know best. It's best to not question God. He's got his reasons for doing things, things that I didn't feel comfortable with. He's got his reasons. Who am I to judge what those reasons might be? And so I just shut it down, didn't allow myself to think. But this time I think also allowed myself to kind of listen to how I felt about things, which before then I didn't really I just didn't think too deeply. But I started to allow myself to think and to go with my instinct of what feels okay. I kind of feel like all I've got is my own conscience and my own kind of feelings about things, and I kind of allowed myself to follow that.
Yeah, I love it. That's super important. And honestly, as we interviewed Stephen Hassan, the author of Combating, he's an expert on, let's just say, unhealthy organizations. And he's developed this model to really detect an unhealthy organization that behavior is controlled, the information that people receive is controlled, their thoughts are controlled, and then they're kind of manipulated through emotion. And so many of us in the Mormon Church live in a bubble where we're impervious to facts and information and other people's experiences. And it sounds like you were just willing to take in information that wasn't necessarily formally approved and then have your own thoughts about it. And that allowed you to form kind of an independent, hopefully less biased, or at least more personal set of conclusions about what the church meant to you.
Yeah.
All right. This is great. So next question, number 5. What parts of Mormonism were harmful to you? So as you're looking back, you've been able to share what things you liked, what things were harmful.
Okay. So I'm kind of going to go through things kind of chronologically, because that's kind of easier for me to work through. So I think, first of all, as amazing as eternal families are, once you come from a divorced kind of broken home, that kind of ideal becomes not so amazing anymore. And it becomes really kind of, it just becomes really tricky to kind of get your head around. I don't really know kind of how clear the church is on these things, but I know for me growing up, we didn't understand at all what was our eternal family, what that meant for us now. Once my parents were separated, we had no idea. We kind of felt like that meant we had to choose one or the other, because how on earth, or it just became really kind of just a really difficult kind of thing for us to get our head around. And then particularly, obviously my dad remarried, and so he got sealed in the temple, and so it felt to me, I'm not speaking for anyone else, it felt to me like my eternal family was gone. My parents were separated, so my eternal family was no more. My dad's now remarried. He goes to the temple with his new wife and her children. They all get sealed together, and we're kind of left outside. That's kind of how it felt. Now, I'm not saying that is the actual true doctrine of it. Like, I'm sure that I'm still sealed to my dad, but as a child, and it's all very confusing and very sort of, yeah. So I think that was kind of the first thing that's damaging. Thereafter,
I just have to say, yeah, the Mormon dreams become a nightmare. The Mormon dream becomes a nightmare if you don't live up to it. So a doctrine as beautiful as eternal families becomes a nightmare as soon as your family doesn't all make it, because then you're living without your family. And so in some ways the church creates a nightmare, where in other religions it's just like, of course all our family stays together in heaven. That's just, but sometimes the Mormon dream can become a reality, a nightmare.
Yeah. And I feel like as I've kind of reflected on my life, I've kind of come to the realization that all the hardships, all the really like difficult things I've gone through in life seem to have been made worse by the church somehow. Like, and I know that sounds really negative and really bad, but I guess as I go through these things, it'll become kind of clear why that feels that way to me. So yeah, the next one was kind of excommunication. I said about my mum being excommunicated, and I think that really harmed our relationship with her and our respect for her. I think we kind of, yeah, like just lost respect for her, didn't listen to kind of what she had to say. And it's definitely damaged relationships there. Not that we have a bad relationship with my mum now, because we certainly don't have a, I saw my mum today and I see my mum, I've got a good relationship with my mum, but I think it definitely harmed it at the time. Okay, the next one was bishops' interviews. That's kind of a big one for me. It's always been a big issue for me, kind of when I reflect back when I was younger, and it's something that, I had no idea about Sam Young and all that sort of stuff until I left the church. But before I knew about any of that stuff, I'd already decided my kids were not going to go through that. They were not going to go through one-on-one interviews with a bishop until they were old enough to be comfortable to decide that for themselves. When my son was turning 12, we asked our bishop what he was going to be asked, because we'd heard, things that we were not happy with. So yeah, bishops' interviews, I think, and I've gone through that, and I defend my bishop in the sense that he was just doing what he thought was right. It was just the culture of the kind of the explicit questioning and that sort of thing that goes on, which I experienced. I think, my bishop probably experienced himself when he was younger, and he was just continuing that culture of what he kind of knew, because as we know, bishops receive limited training on these sorts of things. So yeah, I think that's kind of always been a big kind of problem of mine.
Yeah, that whole, just to combine those two a little bit, that whole church discipline thing, disfellowshipment, excommunication, is just so shaming, and it's so humiliating. And these interviews just are can be lovely, or they can become a deep, horrific problem. So you're not alone in that.
Yeah, and my bishop was kind to me. I'm not, he wasn't not kind, he was kind. And I do feel like he did care for me. But I think being asked like explicit details was just not appropriate. And then the teaching that comes thereafter, about how you've committed, the second worst sin there is, and those sorts of things are just, I think it's only now as an adult that I kind of can reflect and realize that these things have kind of continued with me. Kind of didn't really maybe appreciate how much those things affect you. They affect you at the time, but they actually stay with you, I think, until you realize it, and then maybe hopefully deal with those things.
Right.
The next one for me, I don't know if it's a fair thing to kind of say or not, but for me, having gone through a miscarriage, I always felt like there were no answers. The church has so many answers for so many things that to me are not important, but it doesn't have answers for things that sometimes are important. So I was always really confused what it meant for me. Like, you read in the scriptures about how mothers will get to raise their children in the next life, but I always felt like I didn't know whether that applied to me because I'd had a miscarriage. I didn't know if it applied to me because I wasn't, married in a temple. And those kinds of things were always a struggle for me. Now, that's, it's not necessarily a fault of the church in terms of a blame issue, but I just always felt like we had answers to things, every little detail of what we could or couldn't drink or do, but the bigger things I kind of didn't have answers to. And then also surrounding that time in my life, like the shame and everything that comes with it, nobody talks. Like I didn't have any sort of help coming to terms with or dealing with that loss. Which again, I'm sure there are people in the church who may go through that and do get the help and things, but I think by and large, people don't talk. They don't talk about sex and relationships, and then when things go wrong, they continue to not talk. So I think, I've definitely carried a lot of issues with that because we kind of bury things. When things go wrong, we just bury it and pretend it didn't happen. And that's a real problematic thing, I think, within the church. And also surrounding that, again, kind of the adoption sort of policy that I was always very aware of. I was kind of told after I'd had my miscarriage that I'd had to have given it up for adoption anyway. And that kind of has always been just something that I just can't kind of reconcile or agree with. And I know the church, again, doesn't command that that's what people do, but it's certainly encouraged. And I know of people that have given up babies for adoption on kind of the advice of leaders and family, and that's been a really hard, traumatic thing for them that they probably never get over.
So pressuring women to give up their young mothers to give up their children is not wasn't great.
No.
Yeah.
Then after I kind of dealt with my sort of, I'd gone through my church disciplinary and all that sort of stuff, you're then faced with the rest of your kind of time in young women dealing with chastity, which the church has to teach chastity. I get that, but that kind of, chewed sweet sort of analogy that you kind of taught about, how you kind of, like used to that kind of
the licked cupcake,
it's
also chewed gum.
Yeah, that was kind of a lesson that I've heard. And also for me at that time, like I wasn't allowed to be with my boyfriend. I was told that once we'd sinned, our relationship was bad and we couldn't be together. But I was also very aware that kind of return missionaries weren't my kind of bag either, because I maybe wasn't up to scratch. So you kind of left with, it's just, not an ideal sort of situation for a young girl to be in. Again, I kind of know people say I brought that on myself, but it's less than ideal.
Because it makes you question your worth, right? It makes you wonder whether you're a good person, and no one should ever question that. There's mistakes, there's learning, but worth should never be on the table, right?
No, definitely not.
And the idea of being stained or damaged just isn't super helpful.
It makes no sense. Like the church teaches all about, the atonement. That's what it's for, is to repent and, to have your scarlet sins be made white as snow. And so this kind of notion that, virtue can never be regained and you can't ever quite be kind of returned to purity after it, just, to me, it goes against the fundamental teachings of the gospel. It's just, it's crazy. It doesn't make any sense.
That's hard.
I think kind of women's roles, it's not something I ever really kind of appreciate. Like I would not have considered myself a feminist. I was always very happy to be a wife and a mother, and that was my lot, and I was happy and content with that. Or so I thought. And it's only now that I can look back at kind of how unhappy I was and how, like I could have, I graduated from university and I stayed at home with my baby. But I could have done something alongside that. I could have, still been a good mum and stay at home with my baby and done something to further develop myself, which I didn't really do, because I really felt that my role was to be at home. And that's kind of led to lots of kind of self-esteem and mental health issues over the years. And so I think that's another thing that's potentially harmful. And then kind of the final thing that I kind of reflected upon was sort of authenticity. I feel like I was never able to feel and be my real self. I always had to kind of be my best self and my perfect self for everyone to see. But in doing so, I think you really kind of limit your ability to form meaningful, real relationships. Like, I feel like I've not really ever been able to kind of make real deep friendships and connections with people, because I've always been kind of holding back from, to make those connections, you have to be open, you have to be authentic. And we're just not very good at doing that in the church. We kind of put on our kind of perfect Sunday faces, and we don't really let people see anything beyond. And I feel like that's one of the first things that kind of started this kind of faith journey for me, was kind of realizing that I was 34 years old and had limited, real, meaningful relationships with people. And I kind of attribute that to, I'm not saying that everyone in the church doesn't make those. I'm sure there are people that do make those. But for me, that was kind of part of the kind of negativity surrounding kind of my time in the church.
Yeah. And if you can't really come to know who you are, and if you're always living a script kind of assigned to you that doesn't encourage much depth, it really is hard to have relationships with others, because the relationships are based on appearance. They're based on some role you're trying to play. And you're kind of afraid to go deep with anybody because everybody's trying to act perfect all the time. Mm-hmm. And so there is a real problem with inauthenticity in the church, an inability to really get to know yourself and to be intrinsically driven, and then to have real, deep, meaningful relationships. It's just those aren't a part of, I think, the average Mormon experience for so many.
No. So yeah, that's kind of the last of those points, I think.
Well, that was a long list.
There was still so much good. I feel bad. I feel like I need to kind of balance it out, because I'm not saying it's all bad, but for me, they are the bad.
So does that mean that for you, and this is an impossible thing to really measure, but some people feel comfortable drawing a conclusion anyway, do you feel like the church did more harm than good, or more good than harm, or can you even say?
Oh, to me personally, I don't know. I think in the wider world, the church does more good than harm. I definitely do think that. But I think to those that it harms, the harm is significant enough that it kind of doesn't justify it in a way. Does that make sense? Like, I think the harm could be fixed. There's no need for that damage to be done, I guess. That's what I think, that subtle changes could do away with that harm, and then we'd just be left with the good. That's
it's kind of like when it goes well, but when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong, and it does sometimes really severe damage, to the point of sometimes people being suicidal or ruining families. And so it's always a tricky thing to try and draw a conclusion as to whether more harm or good is done.
I think also, like, we look at all the good that the church does, and it does do good, but there are people out the church that have the same sort of values and good. So that's kind of where it's tricky, is that the good in the church isn't exclusive to the church. So that kind of tips the balance a little bit, I think. But yeah, the church, I still, like, when I first decided that I was going to leave the church, I kind of spoke still at that time super, super positively. And I still am positive, but kind of, I was very, very positive, because my memories in the church are on the whole good, and my time in the church, my life's been good still. So yeah.
You've probably heard that saying that everything good in the church isn't unique, and everything unique in the church isn't good. It's pithy, and it's an unfair characterization. But so much of the good, which is like community and honesty and kindness and service, really isn't exclusive to Mormonism. It's just that that's part of many people's Mormon experience, and it's the exclusive truth claims and the claims of being the best that sometimes is the biggest problem, right?
Yeah, and I think for me, like, the end justifies the means. So if this is the price to pay for exaltation, then that's something you kind of accept and you do it. But then when you kind of learn that maybe things aren't all as you thought they were, that's kind of where things change a little bit. If all these things that you have to go through are just part and parcel to get to where you're going, then it's worth it, I guess. But then when you start to have those doubts and you have those other issues, then they become a bit, like, the damage seems bigger then, doesn't it? That's what I guess I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yep. That's tough. Okay. Next question. This is something a lot of people really struggle to make sense with. How do you now explain the spiritual experiences that you had as an Orthodox Mormon? You didn't mention any big lightning bolt experiences, but so many people struggle to make sense now of things that they once thought proved the church was true. How do you make sense of those moments of serendipity that you mentioned?
Okay, I don't really have any problem with this one, because people have spiritual experiences in all faiths, in all religions, and I kind of feel like that could be, a psychologist could explain them away in no time. So I kind of don't have an issue with that. But also I kind of feel like I do have the faith in something, and so I kind of think anything that brings good, that leads you to good, potentially. So, for example, I kind of struggled with maybe how my dad was converted to the church, and kind of his conversion story. And I kind of thought, well, if it's not true, how did that happen? But maybe my dad needed the church at that time. And so if there is, a greater being, if there is a God, and the church would be good for my dad, then why wouldn't he be led to the church? I guess in explaining this, I'm coming to other questions about what I believe now, I suppose. But I kind of feel like there's truth in lots of religions, or there's goodness in a lot of religions. And so if there is something out there, if there is a God, then maybe he'll lead people to what's best for them. Or does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying is that God can, if there's a God, God can inspire people in and out of Mormonism, and those inspirations can be true, but they don't necessarily have to mean that Mormonism is true for everyone, or the one true church, or better than anyone else, or the path for everyone. It can just be what people need at the time when they receive the inspiration.
Yeah, and also, like, if I think about kind of my spiritual experiences, singing in choirs, well, the feeling that I would get, that kind of feeling of the Spirit, you get through all sorts of other means that are not church related. We get them when you might get it in a nice film that you watch, or you might get it when you're singing not hymns, or you might get it by, there's all sorts of ways that people feel that aren't necessarily church kind of experiences. And then I also think that kind of some of my spiritual experiences will be things like scriptures that have come to my mind, but those scriptures in that moment did help me. And so if there is something else, then that seems perfectly logical to me, that I will receive the help I need in the way that I know how to receive it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes sense. So for you, they can still be divine, those spiritual experiences.
They can. I definitely think they can be, and I definitely also think that can just be, my own my own mind as well. I kind
Just
of think
neurochemicals in the brain, natural brain stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. The brain certainly is powerful. And we know that if you stimulate electronically the right parts of your brain, you'll have spiritual experiences or seizures or dreams or visions. And that's what makes this complicated, trying to figure out what really is from God, if any.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question. What was transitioning out of Mormonism like for you? What was most painful and what was most healing or good about it? So just the transition process itself for people who are maybe going to be experiencing this transition. What was it like for you?
Okay, so it's obviously really, really hard when that kind of penny drops and you kind of feel like, you've woken up and everything's not as you thought it was. It can be really, really, really hard initially. You kind of feel like you're completely losing your whole identity and your whole self, and it can be really hard to kind of make sense of everything. It's hard for me now almost to kind of reflect on kind of how that was for me, because I think you kind of it's up and down and all over the place. Sometimes you're really sad and other times you're really cross and other times you feel really disappointed, and you kind of go through so many just such a range of emotions. But I definitely felt like I was really confused as to who I would be without the church. I had no idea kind of what would become of me, like what kind of person would I be? What would I do if I had hard times? What would I do if, I used to think, what if one of my children dies and I don't believe in this anymore? How on earth will I cope? How will I come to terms with that? And I really felt really, really frightened, really scared of kind of letting go of that faith, because I just didn't know how on earth my head would cope without it. And I kind of thought maybe that over time I would kind of lose goodness, that I would kind of, which I think is what we're kind of taught in church, that without the church and without the Holy Ghost, like little by little we'll kind of slip away, and that and I was kind of worried about that. I thought, what if, I remember having that conversation with my husband, like what will become of me? Like what's going to happen? Another really hard part is kind of dealing with how people are perceiving you now. Kind of people's perceptions are one of the hardest things, because people just believe the myths that they hear. Like it's crazy how many people literally ask you the exact same things, or they don't ask you, but they're talking about it behind your back. The kind of, did you stop reading your scriptures, and did you do something wrong, and did you really ever believe it? And those kinds of things are really hard to deal with. I found that really, really hard to have people question whether I ever really believed it, or whether I kind of slipped up or stopped doing what I should be doing. That kind of judgment that I guess people put on you, that this must have happened because you've done something. It must be your fault. I really struggled with that, especially as nobody actually talks to you. So very few people actually ask you if that is the truth. No one actually comes to you really and says, is this what's happened? So you can't really put people right. You can't really explain. And even if people did ask, what do you say? How do you tell them exactly what's happened? Because you kind of want to protect them from it. And so there's kind of no kind of good answer to give to people when they do ask that question, but they don't ask. So for me, that's kind of, it was really, really hard. Like I thought telling my family would be the hardest bit. And I thought once I told them that I could move on and things would be okay, what I hadn't kind of appreciated is that was just the tip of the iceberg. Telling them was kind of such a small part of it. And actually, I hadn't anticipated how mentally myself would be the biggest struggle, kind of coming to terms with it myself in my own head. That kind of, I think I just thought, well, if it's not true, it's not true. And there we go. I thought I'd maybe just be able to move on. But it was far from simple and easy. It was really, really hard. And I don't know kind of how how long do you want me to take this? Like in terms of, you talking the very, very initial bit or kind of thereafter? Because obviously for me, it's been 6 months or so it's still kind of new anyway.
Yeah.
But I kind of found like Christmas, I found really, really hard. My first Christmas out the church, I just found it felt so traumatic actually. And I think if I look back to December, I was kind of quite on the verge of tears for the whole of December, like just felt like, and I couldn't really make sense of why I was the way I was. I felt like I couldn't really talk to anybody without just crying, and that's not kind of the picture I wanted to paint. I wanted people to think I was happy, and I kind of was inside. I was happy to a certain extent, but there was still kind of, tears were never very far away. Kind of, I was always felt very much on the edge over Christmas time, because it was my first Christmas where I kind of didn't kind of know quite what was what. Whereas before that, obviously Christmas is so focused on baby Jesus and the Savior and all like the nice happy stuff, and for me it kind of was much more kind of confusing. So yeah, December was a hard time.
It's so hard, but yeah, the disorienting nature of it, the learned helplessness, that you can't be happy or moral or healthy without it, the way that it affects relationships, the fact that people won't just ask you that they don't want to know, but then they talk behind your back and make assumptions, and then just trying to pick up and rebuild as if you're kind of born again. I often refer to it as being born again, and that can sound really good, but if anybody's been through an actual birth, it's messy and it's bloody and it's painful. And it really is like being born again. And there's this beautiful potential of a new life, but there's also just all the blood and the pain in the meantime. It's just excruciating.
I think people in the church kind of really underestimate kind of that grieving process, kind of just how painful it is to lose what you always believed to be true. I think people expect that if you don't believe it anymore, what's your problem? Move on, kind of, get on with life. But it was really, really hard for me. Like, kind of when I first decided that I was going to leave, I felt like I would still go back to church. I was absolutely convinced I'd be at church for the carol service at Christmas. I thought that, that's a place that I would definitely go, that I would be able to go to church for activities. I kind of felt like, that I would still be involved. I wouldn't be there every Sunday, but that I still would kind of go here and there, and I wouldn't feel uncomfortable to do so. But it didn't take long for me to realise that just wasn't going to be the case, that I just did not feel at home there anymore, that I felt uncomfortable. And, our bishop did invite us to the carol service, and part of me kind of wanted to go, and I just knew it would be too traumatic. I don't think I could have put myself through it. And then it's the little things like the kind of primary nativity that the kids do before Christmas, where they all kind of dress up and act out the nativity scene. Seeing my friends post photos of their children doing that was really, really hard for me, to kind of realise that my kids weren't going to be a part of that anymore, because they're kind of the good and the nice and the positive things in the church, the happy things, the happy times. And I felt really sad that my younger children have only had a very limited experience in that. And my youngest daughter, she's only 1, she'll never ever have that experience. And people have said to me, well, maybe you could, why don't you just come back and do it? But I don't think they understand how painful it is to go back. And maybe one day it won't be. Maybe one day I'll be able to just kind of go and just do the happy, nice, good things. But certainly this year, that was really hard. And my son's turning 8 this year, and I know that I'm kind of hoping I'm going to be over it by the time he turns 8. But I know at the minute, if he was 8 next week, I'd find that really, really hard. People don't understand. I don't know why people don't understand why, but it's really, really, they're kind of painful things to come to terms with. It's definitely a real grieving process.
And it just takes time. People just need to know it takes years oftentimes and you never fully, get over it. But in with a few years under your belt, you can definitely make peace with it and start to find the friendships in the community and rebuild. And life's always going to have suffering. You're never going to escape the suffering of life. But the downside of staying is that if the church is truly stunting you, and I think it does stunt sometimes people's self-development, their maturation, and their ability to have healthier, happier marriages and healthier relationships. The analogy would be, birth may be messy, but staying in the womb is deadly, right? Or, the Garden of Eden may have been pleasant and safe, but there was no growth there. So it's definitely hard and messy and painful, but if you can stick with it and get tools, get help, get support, find community, and frankly, just give it time, it can turn into one of the biggest blessings of your life.